Nancy Pelosi called JD Vance a hillbilly to his face, and in response, he systematically dismantled her $200 million fortune using her own $24,000 ice cream freezer. Nancy Pelosi just called JD Vance a hillbilly cosplaying as a statesman to the face of a man who grew up eating cereal for dinner because the kitchen was empty while she ate $13 a pint ice cream from a $24,000 freezer on national television. While lecturing him about lacking institutional sophistication for the vice presidency, she forgot one thing. The man sitting across from her holds her family's financial disclosures, her husband's trading records, the CHIPS Act timeline, and the exact price of every pint of Jenna's splendid ice creams in her sub-zero freezer. She called him a hillbilly. He called for the receipts. The Senate Budget Committee hearing on federal spending priorities and institutional oversight was supposed to be a reunion tour. Former Speaker Nancy Pelosi had been invited to share her institutional knowledge about legislative spending, a subject she controlled more completely than any speaker in modern history. She arrived prepared, polished, and operating under the assumption that she was the most powerful person in any room she entered. For the first time in 40 years, the assumption was wrong. Vice President JD Vance sat on the elevated committee dais in his capacity as President of the Senate. The architecture of the hearing room contained an irony that no one scripted, but everyone felt. The woman who controlled the House of Representatives for 2 decades, who decided which bills reached the floor, which members sat on which committees, which votes happened and which didn't, now sat in a folding chair in the building she once ruled, looking up at a man from a town she couldn't locate on a map. A town whose people she called deplorable. A town whose factories she watched close from a distance, measured not in miles, but in tax brackets. Pelosi's opening statement was 6 minutes of condescending elegance. Her signature, the political equivalent of a silk glove concealing a fist. She delivered it standing because Nancy Pelosi always stood when she wanted to command a room. Mr. Vice President, I've served with 11 vice presidents over the course of my career. I've watched them govern. I know what the office requires. It requires institutional knowledge that cannot be learned from a memoir or a podcast. She looked at Vance from the witness table, not down, because the dais was above her, but with the expression of a woman who spent so long looking down at people that the expression persisted regardless of physical elevation. You've written eloquently about your childhood. It's a moving story. But governing is not storytelling. The skills required to write a best-selling book about poverty are not the skills required to manage a $6.3 trillion federal budget. I've been in rooms where decisions that affect millions of lives are made in minutes. Situation rooms, budget negotiations, crisis management. These require a particular kind of person. A person formed by decades of institutional experience, not by a few years in the Senate and a compelling origin story. Her voice reached the register that silenced presidents and ended careers. The frequency that communicated, without stating it aloud, that the person being addressed was beneath serious consideration. With all due respect, Mr. Vice President, you are a hillbilly cosplaying as a statesman, and the country deserves better than cosplay. She sat down with the precision of a woman who calculated the exact devastation that sentence would cause and was satisfied with the result. Applause erupted from the Democratic side of the dais, sustained, appreciative. The applause of people waiting for someone to say what they all thought. A CNN chyron appeared. Pelosi confronts Vance on qualifications. A Washington Post reporter began drafting the headline, Pelosi delivers blistering rebuke of Vance's credentials. Vance did not move during the attack. He sat the way he always sat, slightly reclined, one hand resting on the table, the body language of someone from a place where tension is absorbed rather than displayed. When the applause faded, he let 3 seconds of silence pass. Then the smile arrived. the slight, warm, Midwest nice smile that concealed something precise and surgical. Madam Speaker. Excuse me, former Speaker. Thank you. That was comprehensive. You mentioned my memoir. You're right. I wrote a book about growing up poor in Middletown, Ohio, about my mother's addiction, about my grandmother raising me, about counting change for groceries. He paused. But you know what I remember most about your career, Madam Speaker? It's not the legislation. It's not the speeches. It's the ice cream. The room shifted. The cameras didn't move. The senators didn't lean forward. But the energy changed the way energy changes when someone in a conversation says something that everyone recognizes as the beginning of something that cannot be taken back. April 2020. The country was locked down. 22 million Americans had just filed for unemployment, the largest spike in American history. Food banks had lines stretching around city blocks. Small businesses were dying. The Paycheck Protection Program ran out of money because your caucus blocked the emergency replenishment, and you went on the Late Late Show with James Corden and showed America your $24,000 Sub-Zero freezer, packed with $13 a pint, Genesis Splendid ice creams. You told the American people, and this is a direct quote, "I don't know what I would have done if ice cream were not invented." While people in Middletown chose between rent and groceries, you chose between chocolate and vanilla. You called me a hillbilly. Let me show you what the hillbilly found in your financial records. Let me paint the picture for people who weren't paying attention in April 2020. Because context matters. Vance spoke the way he always spoke when building a case. Conversational. The cadence of someone talking to a neighbor over a fence. The voice that made complicated things simple, because the speaker grew up in a place where simple was the only language that worked. The country was 3 weeks into lockdown. 22 million Americans filed for unemployment. The PPP, the fund designed to keep small businesses alive until the crisis passed, ran out of money. Congressional Republicans pushed for $250 billion in emergency replenishment. Your caucus blocked it. Not because the money wasn't needed, but because you wanted to attach additional provisions that had nothing to do with keeping barber shops and nail salons and diners alive. While that funding was blocked, while every day that passed meant another 10,000 small businesses closing for good, while families chose between medication and meals, you appeared on national television in front of 2 Sub-Zero refrigerators that cost $24,000 combined, showing off your collection of premium ice cream at $13 a pint. $13 a pint. Madam Speaker, in Middletown, Ohio, $13 bought 4 dinners. I know because I lived it. I know because there were weeks when Mama and I ate cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row. Because $13 was the difference between the grocery budget stretching to Friday or running out on Wednesday. You said, "I don't know what I would have done if ice cream were not invented." The Republican National Committee called you Nancy Antoinette. They weren't wrong, but the comparison to Marie Antoinette understates the problem. Marie Antoinette at least had the excuse of not knowing what bread cost. You knew. You chose not to care. He turned the page. September 2020. Every salon in San Francisco closed by COVID restrictions. Restrictions you championed, voted for, and told the American people were necessary to save lives. Small business owners, hairdressers, barbers, nail technicians, people who built their livelihoods with their hands, shuttered their shops because the Speaker of the House told them it was their patriotic duty. Security camera footage showed you inside e-salon receiving a full blowout without a mask. Inside, a business legally required to be closed, walking through the doors of a salon that every other San Franciscan was forbidden from entering. When the footage surfaced, your response was not to apologize. It was to blame the salon owner. You said you were set up. The woman who followed your rules, who lost income every day because she obeyed the restrictions you championed, was the person you accused when you were caught breaking them. The salon owner, Erica Kiyos, received death threats. She closed the business and left San Francisco. The person who followed the rules lost her livelihood. The person who broke the rules remained Speaker of the House. Then, the French Laundry. Governor Newsom's birthday dinner. Indoor dining at a 3-Michelin-star restaurant. $350 per person. Maskless, shoulder to shoulder, while the restaurants in your district were boarded shut, and your constituents ate alone. He set the page down. The next part was not in any file. In Middletown, during COVID, I watched businesses I grew up with close forever. The barber, where Mama took me for haircuts. A 3-chair shop open since 1967. The diner where I ate my first meal, not cooked at home, where the owner knew my name because in Middletown, everybody knows everybody's name. The hardware store on Main Street since before I was born, run by a man named Carl, who let kids sweep the floor for pocket money. These weren't businesses to the people who owned them. They were identities. They were family histories. They were the physical evidence that a person built something with their life, that they took a lease and a dream and turned it into a place where neighbors came, where names were known, and where the transaction was never just commercial, but always personal. The barber cut hair for 3 generations of the same family. The diner had a booth in the back where high school kids went on first dates. The vinyl cracked. The table wobbled, but it was theirs. The hardware store had a bell on the door that rang the same way it rang since 1959. These aren't economic statistics. These are sounds and smells and habits that took decades to build and weeks to destroy. And they were destroyed by rules that you championed and violated, and then blamed the victims when you got caught. I want to be precise about the timeline, because the timeline is the indictment. While the PPP lacked money, while your caucus blocked the $250 billion replenishment that would keep Rosa's nails and Carl's hardware alive, you appeared on a comedy show with a freezer that cost more than what most of those businesses needed to survive. The $24,000 you spent on refrigerators would cover 3 months' rent for 6 small businesses in Middletown. 6 businesses, 6 families, 6 places where people knew each other's names. You showed America your freezer. America showed you their food bank lines. And you couldn't see the difference because the $13 a pint ice cream was in the way. Pelosi's wrist rotated. The dismissive gesture she perfected over 40 years. The circular motion she made when a reporter's question wasn't worth a verbal response. It was unconscious, but the cameras were close, and the cameras caught it. 40 million Americans watched a woman respond to a description of their suffering with the same gesture she used to dismiss a question about her schedule. Now, let's talk about how you paid for that freezer. Vance opened the financial section of his folder. The numbers. This was the round where the conversation shifted from moral to mathematical, from character to accounting, from ice cream to infrastructure. Madam Speaker, your congressional salary is $174,000 per year. You earned that salary for roughly 40 years. Your family's estimated net worth exceeds $200 million. Your portfolio grew approximately 930% since you entered Congress. For context, the S&P 500, the benchmark that professional investors use to measure performance, returned approximately 700% over the same period. Warren Buffett, considered the greatest investor of the 20th century, averaged roughly 200%. Your family outperformed Warren Buffett by a factor of 14. Now, I'm not a financial expert. I'm a hillbilly from Middletown. I didn't learn about options trading at Yale Law. I learned about it later, when I started wondering how members of Congress became multi-millionaires on government salaries. But even in Middletown, we know that when someone beats Warren Buffett by 14 times, the answer isn't, she's a better investor. The answer is, she knows something. And, Madam Speaker, you did know something. You knew what legislation was coming before the market did, because you decided when it came. He walked through the timeline the way a teacher walks through a math problem, step by step, making sure every person in the room could follow. June 2022, your husband Paul exercises call options on 20,000 shares of NVIDIA. At this time, you are shepherding the CHIPS and Science Act, a $52 billion semiconductor subsidy package, through the House of Representatives. NVIDIA is one of the primary beneficiaries of semiconductor subsidies. July 2024. Paul sells over $500,000 in Visa stock. Weeks later, the Department of Justice files a major antitrust lawsuit against Visa. Your family avoided hundreds of thousands in losses through a sale timed before a non-public federal enforcement action. November 2023. Paul purchases NVIDIA call options. Within 6 months, approximately $4 million in profit. During this period, you engage in AI legislation that affects NVIDIA's market position and regulatory environment. 12 documented instances of trades correlating with legislative or regulatory activity across a 4-year sample. 12. In my old line of work at Yale Law, we called that a pattern. In the FBI's terminology, which Director Patel used in recent months, they call it a case. And the timing is immaculate. Not suspicious, immaculate. The kind of timing that doesn't come from reading the Wall Street Journal. The kind that comes from reading the legislative calendar. A calendar that you, as Speaker, controlled. While Americans locked down during COVID, while the businesses I described closed, while Rosas Nails filled out PPP applications rejected for formatting errors, your husband's portfolio included positions in companies that benefited from lockdown. Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, CrowdStrike. Companies whose stock prices rose because the restrictions you championed drove economic activity online, drove shopping online, drove work online, drove everything online and into the hands of the technology companies your husband invested in. The American economy lost $3.7 trillion during the pandemic. Small businesses closed at a rate not seen since the Great Depression. The ice cream economy, the Rosa economy, the Carl economy, the barber economy, the economy of people who work with their hands and need customers to walk through a door, was decimated. Your family's portfolio grew by approximately $40 million during the same period. Lockdown for them, returns for you. He set the page down. My grandmother, Mama, worked her entire life. Armco Steel for decades. Odd jobs when the plant cut hours, cleaning houses, watching neighborhood kids, whatever kept the lights on, Social Security at the end, which she stretched, like it was made of elastic, because that's what poor people learn to do with money. They stretch it until it tears, and when it tears, they stretch it again, because the alternative is not eating. When Mama died, her entire estate, everything she owned after 60 years of labor, 60 years of lunch pails, and sore backs, and black coffee at 5 inches the morning, and knees that stopped working in her 50s. But she kept working anyway because stopping wasn't an option. Her estate was worth less than what your husband made on a single NVIDIA options trade in one afternoon. One afternoon of your husband's trading earned more than my grandmother's entire life of work. And the only difference between your husband and my grandmother is that your husband had information from the United States Congress, and my grandmother had information from the break room at Armco Steel. They named a law after you, Madam Speaker. Not a highway, not a building. A law banning congressional stock trading. Your name is now synonymous with the practice of using public office for private profit. Retail investors created apps to copy your trades. The Pelosi tracker, the NANC ETF. The American people figured out that the most reliable investment strategy in the country is doing whatever your husband does the week before you introduce legislation. That's not a compliment, Madam Speaker. That's an indictment. Pelosi's fingers drummed the table, not the controlled rhythmic tapping of political patience, but the irregular, agitated pattern of someone hearing their financial history read aloud in a public hearing by a person who grew up with nothing. Let me explain why your situation is different from any insider trading allegation in history. Because it's not just about the trades. It's about the system that made the trades possible. Vance's tone shifted from storytelling to structural analysis. The shift was subtle but significant. This was no longer a hillbilly talking about ice cream. This was a Yale Law graduate mapping a power structure. During your tenure as Speaker, you controlled 5 levers of power never held by a single person in conjunction with a family trading operation. First, committee assignments. You decided who sat on financial services, who sat on armed services, who had oversight over the agencies and industries your family traded in. You controlled which members had access to market-moving information and which didn't. Second, the legislative calendar. You decided which bills came to the floor and when. You decided when market-moving legislation became public. The timing of a bill's introduction can move billions of dollars in market value. You controlled that timing. Third, the Capitol Police Board through the House Sergeant-at-Arms, who reported to your office. You controlled the security apparatus of the United States Capitol. Fourth, a fundraising apparatus exceeding $137 million per election cycle. Money that flowed to members who followed your lead and dried up for those who didn't. When the Speaker controls your campaign funding, the Speaker controls your vote. Fifth, media access through the Speaker's press operation, controlling which narratives reached the public and when. When one person controls legislation, timing, security, fundraising, and media, and that same person's family runs a trading operation that correlates with legislative activity, the FBI has a term for that structure. They call it a unified control concern. It's the organizational model they encounter in organized crime investigations. Not because you're a traditional criminal, Madam Speaker. Because the structure is functionally identical to the structures the FBI maps when they investigate enterprises that concentrate power in one person to extract profit. Director Patel made this observation during your last hearing. I read the transcript. He used the phrase, organizational structure functionally identical to organized crime. I want to be specific about why. In a typical insider trading case, the subject has access to information but doesn't control the timing of its release. They're a passenger. They see the road, but they don't drive the car. Your situation is categorically different. You don't just see the road. You build the road, choose the speed limit, decide when it opens, and your family's car is already parked at the destination before anyone else knows the road exists. That's not insider trading. That's infrastructure. And the infrastructure lasted 40 years because nobody in Washington had the standing or the incentive to map it. Until now. He paused. July 2024. You orchestrated the removal of a sitting president from the presidential race. Not a committee chairman. Not a junior senator. The President of the United States, a man you supported, campaigned with, and vouched for to the American people for 3.5 years. Multiple sources confirmed your central role. An anonymous lawmaker told NBC you were at least 50% responsible. Jill Biden, your friend of 50 years, said, "We were friends for 50 years. It was disappointing." That word, disappointing, from a woman known for measured language, carries the weight of a betrayal that took 5 decades to arrive. You made the calls. You worked the members. You applied the pressure that only someone with $137 million in fundraising leverage can apply. Because when the woman who controls the campaign contributions tells you the president needs to step aside, that isn't advice. It's arithmetic. After Harris lost, you told the New York Times that Biden should have gotten out sooner. Not that the removal was wrong. Your only regret was timing. Not faster, not slower, but optimal. The regret of an operator, not a friend. The regret of someone who runs a machine and notices when the machine's timing is off by a few weeks. You didn't remove a president to protect democracy, Madam Speaker. You removed him to protect down-ballot House seats, the seats that determine committee assignments and legislative calendar control, the architecture of power that made your family's trading operation possible. You weren't protecting the party. You were protecting the machine. Because without the machine, the ice cream gets a lot harder to afford. Pelosi's hand moved under the table toward her phone, toward her staff, toward anyone who could tell her what to do with information presented in a format she never encountered. Not political attack, not media criticism, but structural analysis from someone who understood power architectures because he spent his entire life on the receiving end of them. August 2022. Taiwan. Vance connected the dots the way prosecutors connect dots. Not by arguing causation, but by placing events in sequence and letting the proximity speak for itself. You visited Taiwan, the highest-ranking American official in 25 years, to set foot on the island. The intelligence community briefed you before the trip. They told you China would respond with military exercises. They told you the Taiwan Strait would become the most dangerous waterway in the world for weeks. They told you semiconductor supply chain disruptions were probable. You went anyway. China responded with the largest military exercises since the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis. Live fire drills, ballistic missiles launched over Taiwan, simulated blockade operations, ships and aircraft in numbers not seen in decades. The exact outcome the intelligence community warned would happen. Your husband held significant NVIDIA positions during this period. Call options giving him leveraged exposure to semiconductor price movements. NVIDIA's most advanced chips, the ones powering AI, the ones driving the company's market capitalization past $3 trillion, are fabricated by TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, headquartered in Hsinchu, Taiwan. Any disruption to Taiwan's stability is a direct threat to NVIDIA's supply chain, and any government response to that disruption, such as a $52 billion domestic semiconductor subsidy designed to reduce American dependence on Taiwanese manufacturing, is a direct, immediate, measurable benefit to NVIDIA's stock price and therefore to your husband's options positions. In the immediate aftermath of your visit and China's military response, the CHIPS Act, which moved through Congress as standard industrial policy at the usual pace, with the usual committee hearings and amendments and deliberation, became urgent national security legislation. The framing changed overnight. What had been investment in American manufacturing became defending America from Chinese semiconductor dominance. It passed with bipartisan support within days of your return. $52 billion in semiconductor subsidies, the largest industrial policy investment in modern American history, fast-tracked by a crisis your trip triggered. While your family held positions in the primary beneficiary, in the intelligence community, when a subject takes an action, they were warned, would cause a specific outcome that benefits them financially. When they receive the briefing, understand the consequences, proceed anyway, and profit from the result. That pattern has a name. It's called consciousness of financial motivation. It's the kind of pattern that keeps case files open. He paused, finding the Middletown comparison that became the structural rhythm of his presentation. In Middletown, when the steel plant closed, nobody passed a $52 billion bill to save it. Nobody visited a foreign country to create a supply chain crisis that would make Ohio manufacturing a national security priority. The people in my town lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost their health insurance, and the government told them to learn to code. But when your investments are at risk, when the company your husband has options in faces a supply chain threat from a crisis your visit triggered, suddenly the United States Congress can move $52 billion in a week. Suddenly, urgency exists. Suddenly, the legislative calendar opens up. There's always money for the crisis that threatens your portfolio. There's never money for the crisis that threatens Middletown. Pelosi leaned toward the aide behind her. A whispered exchange. 3 seconds. The body language of someone considering whether to leave. The aide shook her head slightly. Stay. The cameras are watching. Leaving would be the clip. One final section, Madam Speaker. This one isn't about money. Vance's voice changed. Not soft. The voice of someone discussing something that matters personally, not professionally. The shift from class warfare to character assessment. The 4th of February 2020. The State of the Union Address. He nodded to the committee's AV staff. The screen behind him lit up. Footage that every American recognized. Nancy Pelosi standing behind President Trump on the House dais, tearing the printed speech in half. The image that defined the political divide of an era. The image that launched 1,000 think pieces about civility, about norms, about the state of American democracy. You tore up the speech. It was treated as a bold political statement, applauded by your supporters, criticized by ours. Most people debated whether it was appropriate. I want to talk about what was on those pages. Because nobody talks about what was on those pages. He didn't read from notes. He spoke from memory. Those pages contained the names and stories of every person honored during that address. Let me read some of them. Charles McGee, one of the last surviving Tuskegee Airmen, 100 years old, who flew 130 combat missions in 3 wars. He was promoted to brigadier general during the speech. The audience stood. The nation saluted. You tore up the page with his name on it. Janiah Davis, a 4th grader from Philadelphia, trapped in a failing school, whose mother applied to a scholarship program and was waitlisted. She received an opportunity scholarship during the speech. Her mother was in the gallery. They both cried. You tore up the page with her name on it. Sergeant First Class Townsend Williams, deployed 4 times, stationed overseas, away from his wife and children for months. He reunited with his family during the speech. The children ran to their father. The entire chamber wept. You tore up the page with their reunion on it. Staff Sergeant Christopher Hake, killed in Iraq by an improvised explosive device supplied through Qasem Soleimani's network. His widow Kelly and his 2-year-old son Gage were in the gallery. A Gold Star family, a boy who would never remember his father's face, sitting in the United States Capitol in a seat his father would never occupy, looking down at the chamber where someone was about to tear up the page with his father's name on it. Ellie Schneider, born at 21 weeks, weighing less than a pound, one of the youngest premature babies ever to survive in the United States. She was in the gallery with her mother. A miracle of modern medicine, a story of survival against impossible odds. You tore up the page with her name on it. Raul Ortiz, an 8th-generation rancher from New Mexico, whose family worked the same land since before the United States existed. You tore up the page with his family's legacy on it. Vance set his hands on the table. You didn't tear up Donald Trump's words, Madam Speaker. Trump didn't write that speech. Speechwriters wrote it. And the words on those pages weren't political talking points. They were people, real people sitting in the gallery, watching you tear up the document that told their stories. A Tuskegee airman who flew 130 combat missions, a fourth grader who needed a better school, a military family reunited after 4 deployments, a Gold Star widow and her fatherless son, a premature baby who survived against every odd. You tore up their stories because you were angry at the man reading them. But the pages didn't belong to him. They belonged to them, and not one of them, not Charles McGee, not Janiah Davis, not Sergeant Williams, not Kelly Hake, not Baby Ellie, was given the courtesy of having their names survive the evening intact. Where I come from, Madam Speaker, where the deplorables come from, where the hillbillies live, we have a word for someone who destroys other people's stories to make a point about their own feelings. We call it selfish. And selfish is the kindest word I have. Pelosi's hand, the hand that tore the speech, the hand that held the gavel for 2 decades, the hand that pointed at presidents and signed legislation and gripped podiums during 1,000 press conferences, rested on the table beside her water glass. And for the first time that anyone in the room could remember, it trembled. Not dramatically, not visibly from the gallery, but the cameras were 3 feet away, and the cameras were unforgiving. The hand that tore a Tuskegee airman's name in half trembled. Vance stood. He buttoned his jacket. The small, automatic gesture that became his signature. The muscle memory of a man who learned formal manners late in life and practiced them with the precision of someone who knows that every detail matters when the world is watching. Former Speaker Nancy Pelosi. 40 years in Congress. A $200 million net worth. On a $174,000 salary. A $24,000 Sub-Zero freezer shown on national television, packed with $13 a pint ice cream, while 22 million Americans filed for unemployment. A salon blowout during your own lockdown, followed by blaming the salon owner who lost her business for following your rules. 12 correlated trades across a 4-year sample. A Taiwan visit that triggered a military crisis while your family held semiconductor positions. The removal of a sitting president to preserve your power architecture, and a State of the Union speech with a Tuskegee airman's name on it, with a Gold Star widow's name on it, with a 4th grader's name on it, torn in half because you were angry. Would you like to respond? Pelosi gripped the edge of the table. The instinct to fight was visible, the set of her jaw, the narrowing of her eyes, the slight forward lean of a woman who never in 40 years of political combat declined to return fire. Nancy Pelosi was, above all other things, a fighter. The fight was the identity. The fight was the brand. To not fight was to not exist. Mr. Vice President, everything I have done, everything, has been in service to this country and to the institution of, including the ice cream? 4 words delivered quietly, not as an interruption, but as a question. A genuine question asked in the tone of a man from Middletown who tried to understand how $13 a pint ice cream from a $24,000 freezer fit into a life of public service. The line landed the way a pin lands in a silent room. Not with force, but with precision. It was simple, quiet, entirely without aggression. It bypassed every defense Nancy Pelosi constructed. Political attacks she could parry. Media criticism she could deflect. Congressional opposition she could outmaneuver. But a question about ice cream, asked by a man who grew up counting change for groceries, in a voice that carried no malice and no triumph, only the genuine bewilderment of someone who never understood how people with so much can care so little. It had no parry, no deflection, no maneuver. Pelosi stopped. The sentence she built, the counterattack that 40 years of political instinct already loaded and aimed, collapsed mid-construction. Not because the words weren't available, because including the ice cream made every possible response absurd. Any defense of her service record now had to account for the ice cream. Any pivot to policy now had to explain the freezer. Any attack on Vance now had to reckon with the $12 at Goodwill and the cereal for dinner. She opened her mouth, closed it. The fight, the famous Pelosi fight, had nothing left to fight with. 5 seconds of silence. The ice cream was always the answer, Madam Speaker. Not because it was the worst thing you did. The trading was worse. The architecture was worse. The pages you tore were worse. But the ice cream was the truest. $13 a pint from a $24,000 freezer, while America starved. That's not a gaffe. That's a portrait. He walked toward the exit, unhurried. The walk of a hillbilly from Middletown, Ohio, who was underestimated by everyone who looked at his zip code and assumed they knew his ceiling. At the door, he paused. "Enjoy the ice cream, Madam Speaker." He walked out. The last image. Nancy Pelosi at the witness table. The hand that tore the speech, resting beside an untouched glass of water. The cameras held for 8 seconds. The same 8 seconds they held on Patel's folder in the previous Pelosi hearing, as if the building itself remembered what happens when someone sits at that table and runs out of answers. 8 seconds of the most powerful woman in congressional history, alone in a room that no longer belonged to her, in a building she once ruled. 2 clips went viral simultaneously, and the difference between them told the story of a political era. The first was including the ice cream. 4 words, 6 seconds, delivered so quietly that viewers had to turn up their volume to hear them. It was shared 300 million times in 72 hours. Not because it was loud, because it was true. The clip spawned a meme format that consumed political social media for weeks. Any politician caught in hypocrisy was met with the reply, including the ice cream. It entered the political lexicon as shorthand for the gap between what powerful people say and how they live. The second was the names on the pages. Vance reading the names of Charles McGee, Janiah Davis, Sergeant Williams, Staff Sergeant Hake, paired with footage of Pelosi tearing the speech. The split screen went viral among veteran communities first, then spread to mainstream media. Gold Star families issued a joint statement within 24 hours. The statement did not mention Vance. It did not mention politics. It listed the names of the people honored in that speech and noted that their stories deserved to survive the evening. The Pelosi Act, the law banning congressional stock trading, the law named after the practice she came to personify, passed the Senate within 2 weeks of the hearing. The House followed within a month. 87 senators voted in favor, a supermajority that included 14 Democrats who previously opposed the bill. The irony was architectural. The law that bore her name, the law she spent years calling unnecessary and using every procedural tool at her disposal to prevent from reaching the floor, became her most enduring legislative legacy. Not the Affordable Care Act, not the infrastructure investments, not the climate provisions she championed. The law existed because she turned her name into a verb. To Pelosi meant, in the financial press, to trade on legislative information, and the country finally decided the verb needed to become a crime. SEC and DOJ opened parallel investigations within 10 days. The GAO audit that Senator Rick Scott requested was accelerated and expanded. 4 separate federal entities with independent subpoena power, each staffed by career investigators who would outlast any political cycle. The most comprehensive financial scrutiny ever applied to a sitting member of Congress, or former member, as it turned out. For Vance, the hearing accomplished something none of his predecessors' Pelosi hearings achieved. Tulsi opened the financial file with military precision. Patel presented it as an FBI case file with institutional authority. But Vance did something neither a soldier nor an investigator could do. He made the numbers personal. He translated $200 million into the language of Middletown, into cereal for dinner and Goodwill suits, and $13, meaning the difference between a whole week of groceries at Dollar General and 1 pint of Guinness from a $24,000 freezer. He made the corruption legible to the people it hurt most. After the hearing, Vance didn't hold a press conference. He called Tommy Blankenship, the steelworker from the Clinton hearing, 6 blocks from Mamaw's house. Then he called Rosa Gutierrez's daughter at Sinclair Community College and asked how the nursing program was going. Then he loosened his tie, the second nice suit, not the $12 Goodwill one, and went back to work. Because that's what deplorables do. Pelosi announced retirement 3 weeks after the hearing. 11 p.m. on a Friday. The burial slot. The time reserved for news that no one is supposed to read. Written statement. No cameras, no final floor speech, no press conference. 200 words from a woman who gave hour-long interviews, who held press conferences that ran 45 minutes, who built a career on the belief that the camera was always her ally. 200 words and silence. The family began divesting individual stock positions within days, transitioning to index funds and blind trusts. The exact arrangement she spent years arguing was unnecessary. The transition was managed by white-collar defense counsel from Williams and Connolly. The symbolism was noted by legal observers. In Middletown, Ohio, on a street where half the storefronts were dark, and the other half held on the way small businesses hold on in towns that the economy forgot, which is to say, barely. Which is to say, with the stubborn refusal of people who have nowhere else to go. A woman named Rosa Gutierrez sat in her apartment and watched the replay on a television older than her youngest grandson. Rosa was 52. She was Mexican-American. Her parents came from Jalisco in 1985, the year before she was born. They raised her to believe that in America, a woman who worked hard enough could build something that lasted. A business with her name on it. A place that was hers. Rosa's Nails opened in 2002. The sign was hand-painted by her brother-in-law Eduardo, a carpenter who did the lettering for free because that's what family does. The colors were pink and white, Rosa's favorites. They faded from 18 years of Ohio sun and Ohio winters, but never disappeared entirely. You could still read Rosa's Nails from the sidewalk, even in 2020. Even at the end, the salon closed in June 2020. COVID lockdown. Rosa applied for PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, the fund supposed to keep businesses like hers alive until the crisis passed. But the paperwork was complex, written in the English of lawyers and accountants. Rosa's English was functional, but not legal document fluent. She filled out the forms at her kitchen table at midnight after putting her kids to bed, using a Spanish-English dictionary and a calculator. The application was rejected for a formatting error. A box checked incorrectly, a number in the wrong column. She didn't understand the rejection letter until 3 months later, when a friend who worked at H&R Block translated it for her. By then, the landlord found a new tenant. The sign came down, and 18 years of Rosa's life were packed into cardboard boxes by Eduardo, who cried while he worked because the sign he painted was the first professional lettering he ever did, and he was proud of it for 18 years. When Vance described the salon, Pelosi getting her hair done in a salon that was supposed to be closed, then blaming the salon owner who lost her business for following the rules, Rosa stood up from her chair. She got her hair done. I lost my shop. Same rule, same state, same pandemic. Different America. Rosa didn't cry. She did her crying, hard, ugly, choking crying the day Eduardo helped her carry the last box out. The day the sign came down and left a rectangle of lighter brick where the name used to be. The ghost of Rosa's Nails on the building's face visible to everyone who walked past, the outline of something gone. She picked up her phone and called her daughter, who studied nursing at Sinclair Community College in Dayton. Studying because Rosa told her after the salon closed that the only thing America can't take from you is what you know. Mia, turn on the television. Someone finally said it. Someone finally said what happened to us. In Pikeville, Kentucky. 3 hours from Middletown. Deep in Appalachia. In the coal country that Hillary Clinton promised to shut down. And Nancy Pelosi never once visited. A man named Danny Watkins watched the hearing from his kitchen table. Danny was 45. He was a former coal miner, 22 years underground, starting at 18. The same year JD Vance joined the Marines. Different paths out of the same Appalachia. Vance went to Paris Island. Danny went down a mine shaft. Both tried to get somewhere. Black lung disease caught up with Danny at 41. Pneumoconiosis. The doctors at the VA hospital in Lexington called it that, the medical word for lungs that absorbed too much coal dust over too many years underground. The word sounded clean and clinical in the doctor's office. The reality was not clean or clinical. The reality was an oxygen tank with a thin tube that ran to his nose, hissed quietly, and made every breath a small negotiation between his lungs and a machine. Danny voted Democrat his entire life until 2016. His grandfather cut coal. His father cut coal. Danny cut coal. All three were United Mine Workers. The union told them who to vote for, and they voted because the union was the only institution in eastern Kentucky that fought for them, fought for their safety, fought for their wages, fought for the black lung benefits that were now the only thing between Danny and the kind of poverty that doesn't have a floor. He switched to Trump after Clinton said Shed put coal miners out of business. He voted for Trump and Vance in 2024 because Vance was the first politician Danny ever saw who described poverty the way Danny experienced it, not as a policy brief with bullet points and solutions from a think tank, but as the daily arithmetic of not having enough. The arithmetic of counting pills to see if you can skip a day. The arithmetic of choosing between the electric bill and the prescription. The arithmetic that poor people do in their heads every morning before they get out of bed, while rich people do different arithmetic in offices where the lights never go off. When Vance said, "Counting change for groceries," Danny looked down at his own kitchen table. The table where he and his wife Mary performed the monthly ritual of dividing coins into piles, electric, medication, food, gas to Lexington, for the VA appointment. The piles never quite covered everything. They hadn't covered everything in years. But the ritual continued because the ritual was the discipline. And the discipline kept the arithmetic from turning into despair. When Vance said, $13 a pint, Danny laughed. Not bitter, not angry, genuine. The laugh of a man who long ago made peace with the distance between his kitchen table and Nancy Pelosi's sub-zero freezer, because closing that distance required energy his oxygen tank couldn't provide. $13 for ice cream, Danny told Mary, who heated Campbell's soup on the stove, the kind that cost $1.19 at the Dollar General on Route 23. We could eat for a whole week on $13. Mary set the soup on the table. She put her hand on the oxygen tank. The gesture she made 20 times a day, the small, automatic check that the gauge showed enough pressure that the flow was right, that the machine did its job. The gesture of a woman who learned to keep someone alive, one tank at a time, one refill at a time, one insurance authorization at a time. But at least, Danny said, watching the screen where Pelosi sat alone at the witness table, the hand that tore the speech resting motionless beside her water, now somebody knows what $13 means. Not one pint of fancy ice cream, a whole week of eating. He ate his soup. Mary sat beside him. The oxygen tank hissed its quiet, constant rhythm. And on the television, the cameras held on an empty hearing room where a $24,000 freezer became the most expensive political liability in American history. She showed America her freezer. He showed America her record. Enjoy the ice cream, Madam Speaker. But what do you think? Did JD Vance cross the line? Or did Nancy Pelosi finally face the exact accountability she evaded for 40 years? Has the era of untouched political elites finally reached its breaking point? Drop your verdict in the comments below. Share this debate to expose the truth, and subscribe before the algorithm takes this down.